knowledge and information. This is the theme of this year's edition of Global Axess. The importance of knowledge has been evident to man since the beginning of time. But the information society presents new questions. How does the increasingly intense flow of information affect our ability to maintain a holistic understanding of the world? And does it actually make us smarter or dumber? Mariano Sigman is an Argentine neurospecialist. He specialises in the studies of how our brain and our consciousness act when making decisions. Can one say that the ability for introspection and self-awareness arose at a specific point in human development? Mariano Sigman shares his thoughts with Thomas Gür.
When we study the brain, as we are able to do now with fairly advanced technology, what do we see? What do we see when people are asleep, when they play chess? What do we see in children's brains? Do we see on specific patterns, or are they unique?
Well, we see patterns of brain activation, but this turns out to be a very complex signal. It's not actually as pretty as we see it in the newspapers, where you see, a certain state of thought and then one or two very well-defined blobs. That gives the feeling that the activation of these specific blobs is what conveys this specific pattern of thoughts, a dream, an imagination, movement, memory, emotion, and so on. So the truth is that despite, I'd say, an immense effort in the community of neuroscience and very vast and productive work, we still do not know what the neural code for thoughts is. So to put it in this way, if you would want to know for any given pattern of thought, the memory of something or the experience of an emotion or making a right or wrong decision, what will be exactly the specific pattern of brain activation that will correspond with this pattern of thought is something that still remains largely unknown. So like to give an analogy, for genetics, today we have a very good idea of what the essence of the code is. We know that there are like 4 letters, 4 different molecules that actually build words that are like the genes, and then the genes make sentences which are genes of genes. In neuroscience, we've learned a lot. We know that the brain is made of neurons, that neurons have this thing called action potentials, where they produce a very intense and rapid signal, and in the specific pattern in time of these action potential spikes, as they're simply called, and how they interact with other neurons, and there's some information. We also know things like, broadly, there are brain regions that are more relevant for specific mental elements, like, for instance, the frontal cortex, which is something that's widely developed in humans, is important for what we call cognitive control. So like when you want to do something badly, but you know you shouldn't do it, so you can hold your actions because you know that in the future this will be wrong. We know that there is a specific region of the brain that's very necessary for this specific computation. We know that there is a part of the brain down here that's called the visual cortex that we know that actually encodes visual information in the brain. And we have a vague idea of how it does so. So it's a bit like a digital camera, that it has a mapping of space into different portions of the cortical mantle. But so I'd say that the state of the field is a mixture in which we've learned by hard work enough that we can begin decoding mental states from brain activity. So it's good enough that we can do that, but it's not good enough that we can do that in a principled way or in a theoretical way.
Sometimes it is said that the human brain, is the most complicated structure we know in the universe today, and it's our brains. From a philosophical point of view, will we be able to understand our own functioning, our own brain functioning with our own brains?
Yeah.
Or do you have to be outside it in a way, or more superior intelligence?
Yes, this is a very good and difficult question. I think that, and I think it's a question more for philosophy today than it is for science. I mean, we scientists can speculate about that. I'd say 2 things. The first one is that systematically, humans have been anthropocentric in all domains. I mean, we thought that we were in the center of the universe, and now we know we are not. And I think a bit that the brain, being the most complex structure in the universe, is
as far as we know.
Yes, but I mean, you could take just a stone, and somehow, you could, grain it down into pieces, and it gets at least it's. I think that we're comparing infinites in complexity, and so I think that in a way complexity is relative to the kind of questions that we want to ask to a system. So that's one thing. But of course, I mean, it doesn't need to be the more complicated one to understand that it's incredibly vast. And again, like the Society for Neuroscience, which is held in the United States every year, holds about 40,000 students. Sorry, 40,000 scientists, the majority of which are students. And when I go there, I always think, you know, you see like 30,000 posters. Each poster is the life, day and night, Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, even weekends, because students work like crazy for years and years and years. So you can walk there and you have the aggregated knowledge of easily 200,000 hours of very intense human work. And then you'd say, well, I mean, it's a lot of effort. What have we learned? And then it comes back to the question we were discussing before. We've learned a lot, but the feeling is still that there's much more to learn. There's much more unknown than what we have actually learned. And so for the question of can the brain understand the brain, which is a philosophical, of course there are all these paradoxes in mathematics, like the Gödel theorem and so on, where
Russell paradox and so forth.
Russell, where you know that logical systems fail when they try to inquire about themselves. So you need another mathematics to actually probe the rationality or the veracity of a certain given formal system. One can think about this argument. It's not directly applied to the brain, but one could think whether this structure is actually conceived to understand itself. And there is even an evolutionary argument that maybe it would be desirable not to understand ourselves. So some neuroscientists have this provocative view that maybe there's a reason why actually the brain would not want to understand itself.
And if we should sum up in a way of, for the last 10, 20 years that brain research has developed so much, and what have we specifically learned that we didn't know before, which is something totally of new or path-breaking?
Yes, it's a hard question, of course, because there's a lot of research and obviously I'm a bit biased toward the things. Yeah, I think that would be. I would feel more comfortable saying what to me have been the more striking things. We now have tools, which you referred to in the very beginning, that allow us to see the brain, which we could metaphorically think as the factory of thought, so to say. And so we could try to read thoughts directly where they're being produced. It's done on a very rudimentary way still, so it's not like you can, from your own wheel of thought, direct a machine that will read all your intentions and desires and sentences and will speak for you. But it's a bit like, the old writing machine, and now we have computers. This is, once the concept is there,
we can develop it into...
Then it's just an issue of technology.
So what type of... I guess we can see some basic emotions. If they are sorry, if they are sad, if they are happy. Can we see more complex emotions also? Or complex patterns of thought?
Yeah, I think that one of the most promising venues, there are two domains where we've been quite successful in decoding mental states from brain activity. One is the domain of vision, because as I said, the brain mantle in which we represent images is organized in a very reasonable way, almost like a camera, where you have a mantle, and this mantle, if it's active here, this means that there's light here, and if it's active here. So you can try to, from the activity in the brain, draw the image, again, in low resolution. So with these, people are doing now things like this. I'm watching a film, and you're watching my brain. And from the image in my brain, you can reconstruct the film that I'm watching. So from the pattern of brain activity, you can actually reconstruct my own experience. You can do more than that. You can reconstruct things that to me were unconscious. So things that I did not there's more in my brain that I can access. This was the huge idea of Freud. I mean, the idea that
I'm aware of consciously.
Yeah, in a sense, let's say in a sense that I could describe it to you.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of information that my brain is processing that we know that affects behavior, as Freud identified, but that if you would ask me, did you see that? I would say no. There's no way that I can report this. We think because it's not conscious. There's a discussion, maybe I was conscious, but I lost it in memory. But in any case, it's not useful for explicit reports. We can hold to this definition of consciousness for now. So this is one venue. It's actually decoding images. Another one would be decoding the action verbs. So things, because when you think of an action verb, like throwing a ball or eating, so those are verbs that are referred to movement, those verbs connect to body parts. So, like when you throw a ball, you imagine that you're actually moving your leg or your hand. When you're speaking, you're moving your voice. When you're dancing, you're moving all your body. And again, because in the brain, the body parts are more or less easily spread on a way that we can decode it, we can infer that. But here's the interesting thing. Imagine you could only decode two things. Like I'm thinking about light in the left and light in the right. Imagine that's all you can do, and it doesn't look like it's enough, but it's a lot, because once you've had that, you can have a communication device where I can...
binary communication.
It's a binary communication, but it's Morse code, but it's good enough. So imagine you're locked in, and I tell you, you know what, when you want to say yes, imagine light in the left. And when you want to say no, imagine light in the right. This is very simple, but this allows me to ask you questions which before I could not ask. So here's generally the way... If you coming back to the beginning of the question, what's my favorite, not just a particular result, but the general project of how I see neuroscience as a fertile human activity, is it's made thought more transparent. Human thought is usually opaque. It's very hard to understand what other persons are feeling. It's very hard to understand what we are feeling. It's very hard to understand what our children are feeling. And actually we struggle for that. They cry because they're hungry, they cry because they want to eat, they cry because they have pain somewhere.
I guess you do understand some of what type of crying patterns there are. This is a hungry cry, this is a...
Of course, we've learned, I mean, we've been around, and your question actually brings me, I mean, I mentioned this, but I should mention it again. I'm not saying that human communication begins with neuroscience. Human communication begins with a species that's actually very highly tuned for the communication and intention. All I'm saying is, in the same way that curiosity for the universe where we belong has been with us forever, but telescope changed the capacity that we can do that. I'm saying the capacity of actually getting into the minds of the other people through technology.
I mean, there were observatories before the telescope was invented, but they were much more advanced with the correct instruments. I guess that's where we are going with the brain research as well.
Yes, and questions that pertain completely to philosophy begin being questions about science with the change of technology.
And now we can also try to define what is human consciousness, from a scientific way, or?
Yes, but when you come to, you can define, I think that, so people will have different views. My view on this is the definition of human consciousness, it's not purely scientific. I think, and I think it's true also for the majority of, I think it's the same for, like, if you could think of the definition of democracy. I mean, we can agree on what a democracy is, we can agree on what, so, because I can ask you questions like, is a dog conscious or not? Is a mouse conscious or not? Is a baby conscious or not? And I think that to answer these questions, we need to agree before. I mean, science can answer this question if we agree on what we accept are the right measures of consciousness. In the same way that if I ask you, is this society a democracy or not? Right. I mean, we may have a discussion.
But I guess we could, we should agree on self-awareness as an important part of consciousness, of an identity of yourself.
Yes, some people will argue that that there's a form of consciousness in which you are actually just being you're aware of your environment. Like, this is a more primitive form of consciousness. You could think you're watching a movie and you're aware of this movie, but you don't feel you're a particularly relevant agent within this movie. And interestingly, this seems very atypical for how we think of consciousness. But the first thing is this is the consciousness of our dreams in most part. So when we're dreaming, we are conscious, we can tell our dreams, we can access the content of our dreams, but it's not a volitional consciousness. It varies, it depends on the dream and on the dreamers, but many often dreams have a consciousness which is different from the waking consciousness, not in the quality of the representation of consciousness, but in the agency, in the sense that we feel we are being part of an experience without actually being the players of this experience. And interestingly, some people, and this goes back to my own work, and we could discuss about that, we have some data, and some people have proposed before, that actually maybe humans have had this form of consciousness, a consciousness which we say is not volitional, a consciousness in which you don't recognize yourself as the agent, as the major actor within the film of reality in which we are. And there is a proposal that in which, if you want, we could dwell in, that humans actually, I mean, even, recent ancestors, only 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, had a very different form of consciousness.
Yeah, because when you look at older texts, which I know that you have done, and if you read older texts, and also still in some many other cultures, that dreams are actually true, in a sense that people actually speak about their dreams as a part of something that has happened in a way outside the world, but in a real fashion.
Yeah, so there are two parts to this. One is the idea of dreams as oracles. So the idea that dreams they have this adivinatory aspect. And for this there's a rationality, in the sense that dreams are not just... Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize, in the last years of his research and of his life, he dwelled into neuroscience and consciousness. And he had this idea of dreams, which I myself think it's wrong, which is that dreams were in a way like just random... It was a moment of complete randomness in brain activation. But this seems quite unlikely. First, because we all know that we repeat dreams often, and the likelihood of this would be extremely low. And second, and there comes the idea of the oracles, dreams seem to be, a closer idea of dreams is that they're closer to play, in the sense that they're simulations in which we alter things. We can ask questions like, they're a bit like science. Yeah. What if? How would I feel if, she would say yes to me? Yes. I mean, in life I cannot experience that, but in dreams I can experience that, and I can understand my feelings and simulate my feelings in the future. So this is a reason why dreams actually have a reason to have been perceived throughout history as oracles. It's that actually that's part of what they are there for, maybe, which is actually simulating a probabilistic future. That doesn't mean dreams are always right, of course, because they're simulations and they're educated guesses about the future, if you wish.
And sometimes I guess they are not also simulations based on normative wishful thinking, that we would like to see things
exactly.
happening.
They're also biased by our own desires and emotions. So there is Chris Fried. He's a neuroscientist, cognitive neuroscientist in UCL in London, which I admire very deeply. He had this very interesting idea about schizophrenia, which I think the first time people listen to this sounds a bit awkward, but then I think it's quite reasonable. I think if you ask people how, like, their intuitions on what it is to be a schizophrenic, it's someone that's plagued of hallucinations and weird mental content. This is how we picture schizophrenics. It's like we do not make these creations. By we, I mean people, not non-schizophrenics, and schizophrenics will make all these weird mental creations. Chris Fried had this idea that, to put it simple, is quite different, saying that we all make these weird mental creations. The only difference is that the people that are not schizophrenic know that they're creating this mental activity. And in knowing that, they know that this weirdness is not something that's coming, from the sky or from the gods or from the muses or from the dreams. It's normal mental activity. Like, you just close the doors of any person that goes in an elevator will start producing thoughts. Oh, I wish, this would have happened, this goal would have been scored, or I would have done this work which I didn't do. And we're, compulsively making a very active factory of thought. But we know we are the owners of these thoughts. And again, this is the kind, in neuroscience, there are all these interesting domains of trying to understand how we do these things that seem completely obvious. But when you think about them, it's incredibly hard to know how do we do them. How on earth do I know that these voices that are on my head belong to me? This is something I need to learn. Children, we think, do not know that. This is why, they have imaginary friends. Yeah. They hear,
But then, when you go back, as I know that you've done, to look on older texts and go through them massively, then you can. I guess you can see patterns of that kind. And it's fairly obvious also when you read ancient authors and legends and so much that people were much more tuned into the voices that they heard. angels talking to them, prophecies, demons coming, visiting them,
yes.
and they didn't quite differ between, and they were obviously not quite aware that they were producing these thoughts themselves. Were they schizophrenics?
Well, so this is Julian Jaynes, I mean, one of the most controversial psychologists in the 20th century, and again, a hero of mine. Julian Jaynes said too many things. Probably many of them were wrong, but he had the merit, I think, of trying to think theoretically about a field that doesn't have too much theory, like we were saying before, neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience. And his idea, which it's summarized in a single sentence, he thought that, before the axial age, so before like 3,000 years ago, not too long. I mean, this is nothing in the history of it. I mean, it's just, yesterday in the history of humanity, or, last hour. The world was a garden of schizophrenics. This was a very different mental landscape. And that, again, that consciousness, the way we know it today, and which seems obvious, where we are the pilots of our own existence, where, and this gives us responsibility, this gives us guilt, this gives us the notion of free will. I mean, all these things, Jaynes claims, are a very recent cultural invention.
So in a way, our understanding of what is to be a human from a consciousness point of view is not something that is it's determined by biology, but it's produced by culture. Is that what?
Exactly? Yeah. But this is
and it's fairly new.
Yeah. Well, this is, and we'll go back again to Jaynes' claim. But yes, this is exactly the point. But this is true for many human virtues. Mm-hmm. So if you ask the question of what are the essential components of human thought, if there are any of them. And then how can you answer this question? You can go to different cultures and try to think which things are expressed. So maybe we all have a sense of mathematics. Maybe a very rudimentary form of mathematics is something that's actually almost like we all, have a body with a certain respiration and with a certain, immune system and so on. Maybe our cognition has features that vary across people but have, a very conserved architecture. So this has been a very difficult question. For instance, is language a human universal? We think it looks like, because we all produce language, but we know it's not. We know that if you get a person and you grow this person not in the right social context, then they will not produce language.
Casper Hauser's Wolf Child.
Exactly. Yes. These stories do have problems because they are a bit... they mix fiction with reality. But the best guess that we can make is that, and we know that humans at a certain point in history did not have a language, or we think that at least. And so you could ask imagination. I mean, have there ever been on Earth humans that did not have the capacity to imagine, or to dream, or to remember? So, I would say memory is an essential element of human cognition, but I do not have the data for that. And I would have said consciousness is also very, fundamental and universal human virtue. What Jaynes suggested and what we've discovered and what we somehow showed down the path of Jaynes is that may not be the case. And going back to the examples you were giving, there's one I like particularly. If you take the relation between Hector and Apollo. Apollo is a god that appears to Hector, and Hector, when he goes to war, he doesn't want to go to war because he thinks he has to go to war, or because he feels he wants to go to war, or because he goes to war because Apollo tells him he has to go to war. Now, this is one thing, and you could say, okay, you need this for courage. I mean, it's not typically how, people would go to war together, but they could still do it today. But another interesting thing is how Apollo tells Hector that he has to go to war. Sometimes it's a god, but sometimes he's walking next to him, side by side next to him. Sometimes he's a friend, and sometimes he's a cousin, he's part of his family. Now, there are two ways you can react to this. One possibility is you could say, well, this is just fiction. I mean, it's a story, and it's a nice story. The other possibility, and this was, I think, Jaynes' leap, is what if this was the description of people the way people were then? And you take it seriously. You take this as now you're a psychiatrist and you're, reading the report of a patient. You read that and you say, Hector was, clear schizophrenic. I mean, it's a book schizophrenic. It's someone that, when he has to engage into actions, he evokes other, entities that actually are guiding in behavior. These entities appear more in certain moments of stress. They appear in different forms, although they typically manifest themselves with certain regularities and so on. It looks like So again, there's this idea that we could then doing a lot of mathematics on trying to understand. The question is so Jane's idea was, if you read books from all the different traditions and you go back, from the older texts, a bit more than 3,000 years ago, and you go down to about 2,000 years ago, after the Axial Age, where essentially religions and cultures and societies were consolidated more or less the way we know them today. So they transition, a very vast social and cultural transition. If you look at all these traditions, what you will see is that the people in the very first days were described as people that had no volition, like I was just describing Hector. And then you go to other people that actually, Jesus in the Bible, eventually you go from the very Old Testament, and then I'm an agnostic person. But again, I'm thinking, what if we take the Bible as if part of it would be a real report of the thoughts of people then? So you can go from Abraham, following the will of God and doing...
Then you see people more introspective, getting more critical about
Jesus,
their faith.
Reflecting about guilt.
Yes.
Him who throw the first stone.
Yes.
I mean, this is someone directing people to think about their thoughts. I mean, it's a pedagogy of introspection. So it's something that the Father would do today, which is an exercise of our culture, which is think about the reasons why you do things, and so. Has this been, have always fathers and mothers, maybe 5,000 years ago, told their children to think about the reasons why they did that? Maybe not. Maybe this is quite recent, and maybe this has educated. Again, not as a biological invention, but as a cultural invention with the same brain we've had for years and years, and maybe for 200,000 years, only very recently, only 3,000 years ago, and maybe not by coincidence, in the moment in which there was an explosion of the capacity of expressing thoughts in solid text, in writings, there was a very deep change in the way we relate consciously to our own environment, to our own world.
It seems very amazing that we started actually speaking about neuroscience, but we ended up in culture. So I guess it must be a privilege in a sense of working in a field that has advanced so much, that there are so important cultural and philosophical implications in the research that is being done by you and other neuroscientists.
Yes. Look, I think this is also a bit of a matter of taste. Neuroscience is very vast, and many neuroscientists, incredibly brilliant and fabulous neuroscience, spend their lives recording in a single neuron. And actually, I think this has been so far the most productive neuroscience, to be honest. Like if you think at the most relevant science actually has come. But I like to think about how the science that we do relates, because we work about science that actually ultimately dwells into human behavior, into the human nature. And so it relates to history, it relates to education, it relates to politics. Why we vote the way we vote, why we are so sensitive to certain manipulations and not to others. And in my own preference, I think that the conversation was not a coincidence that it went there. This has to do with the fact that, this happened in my career too. I began doing, very basic neuroscience, like much more hardwired, biological and physical neuroscience. And more I went to, the more cognitive aspects, the things that are related to behavior, and even more to the things that are related to the human sciences. So I think that, and this is just a description for my own taste, I understood, observing my own trajectory, that the questions that motivate me the most are the questions of the human sciences. But that the way that I like to address these questions are more typical of the natural and the exact and the hard sciences. So somehow I and some group of people, we found this way or this path of asking these questions about humanity from this more quantitative scientific perspective.
Thank you. Thank you so much.